All right, you happily miserable accursed. David Herle here with your ever-loving political panel. Jordan Leichnitz, Kory Teneycke, and Scott Reid. Let's start the pod today with a comment from GR Dude from Apple Ratings and Reviews. The dude writes, best goddamn political pod ever, full stop, hashtag game over. Love the dynamics of the four of you and the honest breakdown of the week's pressing political happenings. Your pod is the highlight of my Mondays. Jordan needs to take less vacation, though. It's getting a bit excessive. Thank you, GR Dude. The four of us abide, except maybe Jordan. All right, here's the rundown this week. So much Greenbelt to talk about. The RCMP launches an investigation. Ford's got a new Greenbelt protection bill. We'll break it all down. The NDP convention. What went down in Hamilton this weekend, including Jagmeet Singh's leadership review. Our cursed clipping is from CBC News, how the Supreme Court dealt a blow to the Fed's Environmental Impact Assessment Act. And then Mr. Pinsent with our Hey Yous. Kory, Scott, Jordan, how are you? Jordan, I know how your weekend was. Did you have fun meeting everybody?
Always.
Connecting with old friends?
Always.
Hanging out in the hallways?
I'm like too old for conventioning now. I don't have the stamina that I once did, but it's always great to see everybody. And, contrary to popular rumor, New Democrats actually do have fun and policy.
It's just debating constitutional bylaws that they have fun at.
Yeah, we love that shit.
Yeah.
It's our jam.
Yeah. All right, well, let's start with the NDP convention. A lot went on there. There's obviously the leadership review vote, which we can talk about the number. There's the sword of that Singh was given on pharmacare with regard to the confidence and supply agreement, and then other assorted bits. Jordan, you're our intrepid correspondent at the NDP convention. Why don't you start off by telling us what went down of significance to Canadian politics at that convention?
Yeah, so I think it was generally a pretty good weekend for them. It was big turnout. They had around 1,300 people down in Hamilton, which is a lot of people for downtown Hamilton. And there was...
She starts by slagging Hamilton. Nice beginning.
Unpopular opinion within the NDP, but no, I think the energy was pretty good. We saw particularly the pharmacare issue really did get good energy, good support on the floor. I think that they did a pretty nice job putting together a showcase, with EB. They had Bea Bruce of the Canadian Labour Congress. Obviously, Wab Kinew wasn't able to attend as he is busy becoming premier, but his presence was very much felt in terms of the narrative of the convention. So I think they did a good job kind of contextualizing it in some recent wins. It's not unusual for other policy items and for Israel-Palestine to take some slice of the convention's energy. That has happened pretty much I think at every convention I've ever been to, and this one was no exception, obviously given circumstances. But still, there was most energy and discussion that I saw on the floor for the majority of delegates definitely went into strategic questions around pharmacare and the confidence and supply agreement. And as for Singh's leadership review, so he ended up with 81%. And for context, we really love our democracy in the NDP, which means that we do a leadership review vote at every convention. So I want everybody to just imagine how much fun
What does 81 mean? What does 81 mean? In 1986, John Turner faced a full-on campaign to remove him from office and from the establishment of the party, and he got 78%. So what does 81 mean?
I don't think it really means a whole lot. I think so obviously
76.5.
Yeah.
It's a bit lower than Singh's last result, but looking at the context around it, there's no one organizing against him. It's not at all that same context. And what I would say is that to me, it's not necessarily that surprising. He's out there doing something quite new for the NDP in terms of the confidence and supply agreement. It's pretty bold for a party whose membership typically has a really ingrained hatred of the Liberals, and so it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. It's sort of a high risk, high reward scenario, and so that there would be maybe a fifth of delegates who felt like that wasn't their jam. I'm not really that surprised. I think Of course, he probably would have liked a higher number, but I don't think it's particularly any cause for alarm when you look at what the broader context of the moment that the vote is happening in. And actually, it was interesting because the way that the weekend was ordered, that vote ended up, the leadership vote happened before the convention passed the resolution about universal pharmacare as the red line. So I actually think that if things had been reversed in schedule, you might have seen even a bit of a stronger number, because a lot of people that I talked to, even if they expressed some doubts about the confidence and supply agreement, really felt that vote on the pharmacare gave some teeth to it. Like, they liked that as the way to kind of hold the Liberals' feet to the fire. So, maybe it could have been ordered differently, but the only thing New Democrats like more than debating policy is changing the convention agenda on the floor. So, of course, that's what happened.
Kory, as a coward, I don't like personal confrontation. So I don't throw this at Jordan because that would be confrontational. But as I followed the convention, it seemed to me that in the corridors, what people were talking about was how the Conservatives are stealing their vote, and how they are losing the working class voter to Poilievre, and what they're going to do about that. And I ask you, as the Conservative whisperer on this panel, where do you think pharmacare ranks as a wedge issue to get those working class people back?
Very low. Very low. You're talking about a lot of unionized workers that have excellent healthcare coverage already. If you're talking private sector union membership. And if you're looking at, actually, I think, was it Coletto or was it, I'm trying to remember which pollster did something recently around this in terms of where the popularity is, but I don't think it's changed in other polls I've seen. It means testing on something like pharmacare gets a lot higher support basis. But I still think it's, as we talked about in New Brunswick, I still think it's something of a dead letter. I don't think that this is going to be implemented before the government changes, because I think that's where this is heading. Every province essentially does not want to do this or go down this road. It's provincial jurisdiction. The priorities, I think, if you're listening to the provinces around healthcare, are more support for entitlement programs and that are there, and where there would be, if there was more federal money around, where would it go? It would go into home care. It would go into more acute care beds. It would go into more long-term care. There, more doctors and nurses for ERs and other things. Like these are the priorities largely for the public, overwhelmingly for the provinces. And look, the provinces have seen how these programs go in the past. They start as being enticed in with 50% funding from the federal government, and then it moves on to something more like 80-20 provincial financed. And the provinces are, as a collective group, broke. And the federal government, who through the idiosyncrasies of our constitution, our system of government, have the taxation power, and the biggest spending items come on the provincial side. So I think this is a, pay for what you've already purchased before you start adding new things to the cart, is I think where you would hear most provinces coming down. But with respect to kind of working class voters that are leaving the NDP for the Conservatives, when Jordan was saying that Singh's unconventional, I would say, yes, of course. He's the first person as an NDP leader to try to campaign for that vote in $4,000 suits with a fine collection of Rolexes. It's a really unusual approach.
Now, Kory, just because you're jealous.
No, I look. I appreciate those things. I'm not that voter though. I'm a former Saskatchewan, now Toronto fancy pants guy who likes all those things. But that's not how you're going to appeal to those folks. So I think, look, I wouldn't be super happy with the leadership number he got. And I think if there was an alternative to him on the table, and if the NDP weren't, financially so stretched where a leadership race was a possibility, I think that you'd see even more people wanting it, because basically Singh's been stalled at more or less 18 points for a few years now. And, that is not a number that is good for the NDP. that is not a sign of success and growth. That is a sign of stagnation and serious problems, especially when you look at the voters that they're hemorrhaging to Poilievre.
Yeah. Scott, they really were focused on Poilievre and the Conservatives at this convention. Not much talk about the Liberals. Speaker after speaker, including Singh in a major address, tried to separate Poilievre from the ordinary Canadians he purports to represent, and to use things like past votes and use things like his positions on issues to try to say he's not what you think, and that, things like he's an anti-union guy, etc. Do you think they were successful at laying some track? I mean, obviously you don't turn something like that around with a few convention speeches, but do you think they have an angle?
Maybe. I don't know. I'm going to be, I think, uncharacteristically absolutist. I think this was a 4-alarm failure of a convention for the NDP. I really do. Sorry, Jordan, but I think it was a complete failure. And I think that's unfortunate because I could see professional efforts that made sense at work where they were trying to do things. Like they were trying to keep this historically divisive, corrosive issue of anti-Israel rhetoric out of the convention, try to minimize in terms of resolutions, try to strike some balance that would allow the floor to be comfortable. If you listen to Heather McPherson, but also just get through without it being the news. It was still the news. The protest made it the news, coming in his speech. So that was the failure. I thought that his speech was interesting. I might come back to that. But then also, I think you look at it and you say, even if they succeeded in what they hoped to, which they at least partially did, pharmacare may not have been the news, but their objective was to emerge arming him with a pharmacare cannon that he can fire at the government if the government fails to do what they want. And I don't think that's a good play for them. I mean, I understand why internally they say, see, no, this means we're going to get progress, but they're not going to. It sets up the next round of disappointment because the government will initiate process. They'll determine in the end, and Singh will be forced to square the fact that some measure of process is good enough to maintain detente. He won't use he won't fire the cannon. He will not fire the pharmacare cannon. He'll point it and then not light the fuse. And so that just perpetuates the cycle of weakness, or the appearance of weakness. And I think even if they succeeded for all the reasons you and Kory have digested, I don't, this isn't a winning issue for them politically, no matter what you think of pharmacare. And I'm starting to question whether I even think it's the right policy, to be candid, in the current circumstances, but it definitely is a political loser. And so I look at that, you go across the board. The things they didn't want to have happen, so that's a failure. The things they wanted to have happen that partially happened don't work for them, so that's a failure. I think it was an abject failure. The one last thing I would say is that I thought his speech was interesting tonally. I thought the most interesting thing was the way that Singh sort of said, hey man, this fucking deal I got myself in, like it can kind of be a squeezer sometimes. I know it. Like I hate the questions. I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking when you look at me. I get it. I hear it. And I'm dragging this goddamn thing around. But listen, there's a good reason to drag this fucking thing around. And so I kind of like that. I thought that was interesting. I don't know about the attacks on Poilievre. I mean, I agree that fundamentally revealing the guy to be what he is and not who he says he is good political logic, if for no other reason than conservatives, modern contemporary conservatives, love to play the hypocrite card. That's their favorite card. That is no trump for these guys, right? Like, holy smokers, right? You're a fucking hypocrite. You said one thing, you did another. We got you on camera saying this. We found this quote. But I feel like, again, it's all a little late. It feels like he is starting to cement where he is, and I'm not sure that's a forward-winning argument. And in any event, I think it's a paid media argument, which everybody's failing to do. I think you got to hammer the guy with ads and get people doubting that. I think out of the mouth of another politician, people blow it off as just partisan politics and or envy. So, but I'm sorry, Jordan. I thought the thing, even though it was a big, boisterous convention, and I don't agree with people who say 81's a small number. I don't care about that. I think that's fine. Doesn't matter. But I thought it was an abject failure.
What does the inexorable march of digital transformation have to do with helping Canada meet its climate goals? That's a question we've explored here before, Hurly-Burlyites, on behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS. Short answer, a hell of a lot. I can hear you whispering, they're a technology company, Herle. They've got skin in the game and they sponsor your damn pod. True that. So here's some compelling third-party validation. Accenture, the global strategy and consulting firm, regularly reports on the economic and environmental benefits of 5G in Canada. They've just released a report on the power of digital transformation and connectivity, and how it helps us meet our climate goals set out by the Paris Agreement. How are we doing on those? Reality check. We've only reduced emissions by 9% toward those Paris commitments. So the report presents a myriad of suggestions to help industries digitally transform and lower their greenhouse gases. The biggest and most impactful? Using connected devices to make processes more efficient and operations simpler. Here's just one example from the agricultural industry. Automated crop monitoring and sensors that reduce water and fertilizer use by 20 to 40%. On the enterprise side, a shift to the cloud not only makes resource management far more accurate and efficient, it'll lower greenhouse gas emissions of traditional data centers by 98%. That's a nice thought. All of this requires investment, of course. It takes a whole whack of money to build out world-class networks that can support this kind of digital infrastructure. Well, TELUS is here for it. Earlier this year, they announced a more than $81 billion investment into infrastructure operations and spectrum. They want to speed the digital transformation that'll help Canada reach its climate goals. Oh, you know what else it takes, Hurly-Burlyites? Support from government and a legislative and regulatory environment that continues to make those investments make sense. John, let's talk about the pharmacare thing for a second, and you can address Scott's thing. I'm fine with that. But so having looped around, I want to come back to you and see where you think the votes are on this. And I'll just as a preamble say two things. One of which is, we did a lot of this kind of programming in the latter couple of years of the Wynne administration. And the only thing that we did in that time that really moved any numbers for us at all was the minimum wage thing. The other programs were not impactful politically, but the minimum wage was impactful politically. And I think there's maybe some lesson to be learned there. And I look at this and, childcare agreements have been in place for a couple of years now. I don't see the vote lift for either of the parties. Dental care has been in place for a year now. I don't see the vote lift for either of the parties. Stack this additional pharmacare log on the fire. Why will that make a difference?
So as we talked about a bit before, I agree with the note. I don't think this is transactional with voters. I don't think people go into the ballot box and say, my God, thank you, NDP, for getting me dental care or pharmacare or whatever the specific policy win is. I don't think that that's how voters make their decisions, and your research bears that out. But where I do think that there is some help for the NDP in this is about showing competence. It's about demonstrating kind of consistent engagement on this sort of thing. It's space in voters' minds in a governing frame that is something that they actually rarely have access to on the federal level. So I think it's about passing a bar on that competence test. It's a far less about the actual specific item, the specific win. And I think to address some of Scott's points about the agreement and how useful pharmacare is as a stick. Yeah, look, I mean, to me, this is actually a lot more about the NDP setting up to pull the plug. I think that that's a more likely outcome than the Liberals actually giving them what they want in this pharmacare agreement. So, and if you look at that if you look at this as a setup for that, then I think it actually starts to make a lot more sense. The NDP is free to blow this agreement up at any time they want to do. It does not mean an immediate move to the polls. They can support on a vote by vote basis, which has been something I think, you've talked about as a strategy that they might like from the get-go, but they have that option at any time, right? And so I think that coming out of the convention with this saying, look, yeah, my members are really squeezing me on this and we have enough juice to go. I don't think it harms them. I actually think it gives Singh a lot more options.
Hey, if the game plan here is to bring the government down, then hallelujah. Because if you guys pull the plug on Trudeau, the NDP will have fulfilled its desire to truly walk in the complete set of footsteps of Jack Layton by bringing down a progressive government and delivering unto the country the most conservative government it's had to date. That was Harper. Now he will be topped by Poilievre. So there we go. Worship of the idol of Jack Layton and repeat your history.
Wow, my goodness. And the last thing I want to say to Kory is, well, hold on though. Before we move off of it, because I think that what Scott touched on in terms of the case that Singh was making against the Conservatives, I'd like to point out, though, he's the only one fucking making that case. Why is he out there by himself doing that? Where is the red team on this stuff? So in terms of,
there's Mark Miller's Twitter account, and that's about it.
Right. Great. Really, it's good. We'll just put a few bucks behind that. We'll make some good billboards. It'll be perfect. Look. Singh going after the Conservatives is smart politics for them. It's smart electorally. That is the key battle that they're going to be having in some of their most vulnerable seats. And so he needs to be bringing that fight every day. It's also smart internally because that is the fight that many New Democrats want to have. It's with the Conservatives. It helps with fundraising, which will help the party's fiscal economic situation a great deal. And frankly, as the Liberals are sort of adrift on some sea of, I don't know, whatever it is that they're doing right now, and Canadians start to look at who might be in place to stand up to Poilievre, Singh's going to be right there talking about all of the right things in that frame. So I don't think that it's bad for him. I do think that they should put some bucks behind it. But it strikes me that really he's the only one out there making that case right now.
By the way, Scott, that is a significant difference, by the way, in that Layton never ran against the Conservatives. Layton ran against the Liberals. As far as I could tell, Layton was fine with Harper being the prime minister in the 2006 election campaign. What was important was that Paul Martin not be the prime minister. Singh has taken a very different approach to this.
Yes, and will happily arrive at the same result.
All right.
But the Liberals are more the enemy of the NDP, I think, in the short, medium, and long term than the Conservatives are. Like now they're hemorrhaging some supporters to the Conservatives, but at the end of the day, you're talking about two progressive parties battling for the souls of progressive voters. And the one that is stronger is typically the one that gets a couple of points shaved off the other one when it comes time to actually cast a ballot. And I think the challenge for the NDP this electoral cycle is the same that they always have. They are the weaker of the two. Like they need to find a way to win the progressive primary. And, and if that's attacking the Conservatives and being the stronger one in that way, well, okay. But, what are the issues that you're putting in the window to make that case? What are, where are the vote drivers? I just don't see pharmacare as being a particularly good vote driver on either side of the ledger. I don't think it's a good defensive play against, largely unionized workers that are looking at Poilievre, because I think they're already covered. And I don't think it's a particularly strong one for progressive voters as currently framed, because when you look at the polling on it, it doesn't seem to be a vote mover. It doesn't seem to be, an issue that's at the top of the agenda. Like if you want to talk about learning things from Wab Kinew and the race in Manitoba, don't you think it'd be much better to be talking about very tactile things around ERs and doctors and nurses? And those are the things that drove votes in the Manitoba election. And where I think the smart play was, this is not that. This is not emulating success. This is, off on a different page.
Kory, just to stick with you for a second, I am interested in one difference, though, between the feds and the Prov on this, which is labor and unions. And I did notice in the NDP rhetoric this weekend was dredging up Poilievre's past views about unions and about right-to-work legislation and et cetera. And now, the PCs in Ontario made it a mission to make peace with labor, or at least private sector labor. And to make it clear that they supported unions and that they thought unions were an important vehicle for advancing the middle class. That's not where Poilievre is at. And do you think that's a potential wedge with working class voters?
I think it is, but then you'd make that the centerpiece, not the secondary or third or fourth or fifth item in terms of your comms. I think I would put it much more front and center if that was the case. As you know, unless you were paying very close attention or were in the room, that was not driving any headlines coming out of that convention. It was all around pharmacare and that agreement. And let's talk about the other thing that was driving headlines. Is the mollycoddling of anti-Israel sentiment and Hamas, which is the other thing that drove headlines. And I'm not saying that that's the leadership of the NDP who were saying that, but I'm saying that is certainly, if you're looking at the coverage, one of the big takeaways was division around Israel and Hamas. So, I'm not sure how that's helping it. Like, that's a, intramural fight within the NDP that, as you pointed out, has been going on for a long time. But, when we were talking about this in question period with Tom Mulcair on Sunday, he was pointing out that the balance that was struck under Leighton and under his leadership was upset quite dramatically under Singh, and that the position that they have now is not a balanced one. And that is not a criticism coming from me or the Conservatives. That's a criticism coming from your old boss, Jordan, who was the leader of the NDP.
Well, I think, on that issue, there's quite a bit of history there. I would reject that characterization of the position. I think that events have moved along a good deal since the time that Tom was leader there. And there's no question that Singh has advanced the party position, but it's not in any way out of step with where other social democratic parties are at around the world. But what I would say is this. With respect to that issue,
is it?
No, it's not.
Because what's happened between now and then is one of the most horrific terror attacks in the history of the world. And it's driving headlines. So something big has happened. And to have a Hamas sort of sympathetic aura around the party right now plays a lot differently.
I don't think that there's a Hamas sympathetic aura around the party, Kory. I think that's bullshit. There were a few protesters. The vast majority of whom
Kory,
were not
Hamas
party
adjacent.
members.
That's the phrase you want to use so that you can swing back on two previous pods. Come on, do I have to write this shit for you?
I'm calling bullshit on this, and I want to point out actually something to Kory as well.
Look at some of the statements that have come out. Like, why is the MPP for the riding where the convention actually was able to go to a pro-Hamas rally and spew the kind of bullshit that she was on social media and still be a member of the party? Like, if somebody did that around white supremacy or something, we'd throw them the fuck out of the Conservative Party in a nanosecond. Why is this person still representing the NDP? It's unbelievable that they are.
And that was a terrible distraction for Marit.
I think
Kory, I think, was pretty happy about.
All right. I'm gonna moderator's gonna move in here. Jordan,
I do want to say one thing though about that, because I've been involved in this issue with the party since my time joining the party. So you can all send me flowers and condolences. But what I also saw happen on the floor of convention on the issue of what's happening in Gaza and Israel was that members on the floor were given the opportunity to vote on an amendment to a resolution that included language like boycott, divest, and sanction and Israeli apartheid, and they rejected that on the floor. So I think Kory is mischaracterizing what the tone and tenor of the convention was in the vast majority of attendees here. There are always going to be people on the very edges of these debates, but the vast majority of attendees there were supportive of a balanced policy and were very supportive of what Heather McPherson and Singh were saying over the course of the week previous and that weekend.
You got to take those.
We can talk more about this tomorrow.
And hop in a time machine back to when you were calling the Conservatives Nazi adjacent because a couple of members went and met with somebody from the AFD. So
I do think people have responsibility for who they hang out with. I agree with that.
Yeah, but who you allow to represent your party in a parliament in Canada, I think, is a lot more apropos to the point here than what you were bringing up as being, quote, Nazi adjacent, which is ridiculous.
I think that when somebody who does not have this as their critic portfolio, who is not a federal politician, feels the need to unilaterally put out a statement.
MPP.
She wasn't even at convention.
Scott's thinking about the 49ers right now.
It's not nice.
He's just mentally gone to San Francisco entirely.
Let's move on.
Rub McCaffrey's oblique.
Well, as they say in Westeros, winter is coming. And I'm going to make a little prediction here. After we get slammed by that first wall of snow and ice, some of us will be wandering around Canadian Tire, asking the guy in the red shirt if there are any snow shovels left, and maybe a couple of bags of salt. And you know, there won't be. Because you got to have a plan. Our sponsor, CN, has a plan. How's that for a segue? Anyway, they do. They have an official winter plan just published. Why? Because when you're responsible for keeping the Canadian economy moving, having an actual plan is good business. How bad this winter will be is still anyone's guess. But listen to this. 2 years ago, CN had to deal with temperatures below minus 30 for more than 50 of 65 days. That kind of cold attacks brake hoses, tracks, and wheels. Trains must be shortened. Last year wasn't a lot kinder. And then there are a slew of new and looming government regulations. Interswitching, a system that allows shippers to force railways to deliver cargo to each other, will absolutely result in delays. The federal government intends to introduce labor legislation that will in all likelihood result in more and longer-lasting strikes. In May, new federal rules increased paid sick days and drastically shortened maximum shift times. As a result, railways will have to hire more people in the midst of a labor shortage to move the same amount of cargo. Winter and all its attendant inefficiencies will further slow supply chains. Make no mistake. Yes, trains must move, no matter what the hurdles, or the economy shudders and stops. CN just wants its stakeholders to know there are heavy new headwinds. Let's move. We've got a clipping. We got a clipping this week. It comes to us via Kyle Bax of CBC News. And it is about the Supreme Court's decision last week on Environmental Assessment Act. Chalk up a win for the provinces and a loss for the federal government's environmental ambitions. In a 5-2 decision released on Friday, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled against Ottawa and in favor of arguments from provincial governments about how major projects are approved in the country. The decision clearly states the environment is an important issue, but the federal government can't overstep its boundaries into provincial jurisdiction, such as power plants and natural resource projects. Canada isn't the only country struggling with regulatory efficiency, according to Marla Orenstein, Director of Energy, Environment and Economy at the Canada West Foundation. She notes that the United States, the UK, Germany, and Australia all have similar issues. Everybody's saying that this regulatory process takes too long and is too uncertain and that it's going to impede our clean energy targets, Orenstein said. The Alberta government led the fight against the IAA, originally called Bill C-69. It was characterized by many conservative politicians in Alberta, including former Premier Jason Kenney, as the No More Pipelines Act. Okay, so this is kind of a big deal. Kory, when Trudeau and Butts used to talk about this back in 2015, the core concept was social license. The theory was that their legislation would get projects approved more predictably and more quickly than what they found in place, because the theory was that Harper's environmental regs were too lax to create social license. And so therefore you had all kinds of civil society groups standing up and forming legal actions to block, etc. And that they would put in place this credible process and things would sail through. What went wrong?
Well, it was a theory that didn't turn out to be correct. We haven't seen things get approved more quickly. But moreover, I think you saw, in implementation, in execution of this, my favorite member of the federal cabinet, little Stevie Guilbeault, running around and threatening to use it on every other project that he could think of. So including things like the Ring of Fire, including things like the 413 highway, which, the province of Ontario got massive support for in a provincial election. And yet he wants to block it by bringing in a federal environmental impact analysis on a provincial highway. Like it's overreach of the worst form. And, I think the court saw it for what it was. So look, the federal government has been able to run roughshod over provincial rights for a long time now, but they've typically done it by buying their way in through some sort of voluntary agreement with the provinces in exchange for money. That's not what this is. There's no provincial agreement in terms of taking this approach from most provinces. And what you've seen is just a never-ending creep of jurisdictional authority being snatched by the federal government in these areas, without any dollars, without anything. So, for instance, if you're talking about infrastructure things like the 413, you've got a federal government that's happy to let 1 million more people a year into the country and not even allow you to build a fucking highway so that they don't have to sit in traffic constantly. So, it's really, I think, the first good decision I've seen from the Supreme Court in quite some time. Happy to see it. I think it's totally justified. And I think if the federal government wants to play in areas of provincial jurisdiction, they'd be better to take the more traditional path of coming with a checkbook and getting a voluntary agreement, as opposed to just trying to use regulatory process and unconstitutional legislation to do it.
So, Scott, the two federal ministers, Wilkinson and Guilbeault, went up to a microphone after the decision, and they, I thought, were at significant pains to make it appear largely inconsequential. Nothing of big principle happened here. A couple of tweaks. I think they may have even used that word. Tweak the legislation to make it conform with the guidelines of the Supreme Court. They certainly didn't look like they had been brushed back from the plate in any way. Nor, and I just throw this out for you as well, nor do they talk about this from a development economic side of things. They only talked about it from the environmental protection side of things. Interested in both of those things. How did you think the feds have reacted so far to this?
Well, I have the same read as you, and I thought it was a fairly unimpressive performance. And I'm going to sound like Kory, but particularly from Guilbeault. I mean, I also saw an interview with him afterward where he was expressly asked, is this in effect the Anti-Pipelines Act? It took him about 11 minutes to answer it. And only at the end did he finally say, listen, it isn't. And I actually approved a pipeline at one point under this framework. So instead, he just blathered on about effectively making the argument inadvertently that, yeah, I'd like it if there was nothing. I thought it was such a contrast. You've got Danielle Smith saying, check out this ruling. That's it. Alberta's its own country. I am emperor, and pretty soon we're going to sail down the Nile and take Egypt as well. It's this is the new Roman Empire from Edmonton, and then you've got like Guilbeault sort of saying it's no big deal, it's nothing, whatever. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we just need to, just sort of shake the legislation slightly to the left, a little to the right, circle 3 times, and it'll be fine. And I found that perplexing. I think, it's not as consequential as critics suggest. It's not as inconsequential as the government led on. And the gulf in terms of their center of gravity on this issue was really, really apparent, as you say, between economic development and the orthodoxy of environmental enforcement. I have 2 other hot takes on this issue, I think. One is, I think, people sort of say, well, Jesus Christ, can't you just get this right? Like, isn't it possible that we can put in place a legislative and regulatory environmental assessment framework that'll allow us to fully engage all Indigenous groups, understanding the fact that they're actually diverse, not homogenous in their perspectives and interests, all the local communities, wildlife aspects, missions, of course, and make certain that we can then move in a rapid fashion, get all that done quickly so we can get stuff built. And why can't you guys just get that done? And I guess I'm starting to ask myself, maybe it can't be done. Maybe you literally can't make all those things happen at the same time. And so I don't know where I'm going. It's kind of fatalistic, but I sort of look at it and I go, I'm not certain that this silver bullet regulatory framework exists. And So that's the first thing.
It's 25%
I'm not sure
more
anyone's
difficult
actually
than changing
tried,
the Constitution. Well, no, this has been around for a while, but you're talking about a process that's probably 25% more difficult than changing the Constitution. We know how easy that is. Like it's.
I kind of sound like Guibo. I'm not convinced the constitutional issues are as actually in the jurisdictional issues is overwhelming. As long as it's not overreach.
But okay,
let's pick up on what you said.
The second thing I want to say. Wait. I want to say one thing.
Your first thing was interesting. We want to talk about. You got a second
I want to. Let's get away from it quick then. The second thing I want to say is, look, environmental impact legislation, electricity regulations, carbon tax, net zero by 2050, 45% reduction in GHG emissions by 2030, which is like fucking 6 years from now, right? I guess like I'm starting to wonder if like you take a look at it, all of these ambitions of the 2015 to 2018 Trudeau agenda on climate, which sounded like activist policy at the time, have now become the painful reality of this political moment, right? They are 2023 to 2024. Like now it isn't, we're way past the can promise and pretend it's all things to all people stage. And now we're at the holy shit. People have to pay the carbon tax. People have to deal with electricity rates.
And at the end of all that, Scott, the polls say that the Liberals have a 7 percentage point lead over the Conservatives on who's best to handle the environment. And the Conservatives have a 40 fucking point lead over the Liberals on who's best to manage the economy.
This is my point, which is that we're now in the worst of all possible worlds. And it's just like all these things felt like they were winners 7 years ago, and they're all coming home now, and they're bumping it as they go from promise to actual implemented policy. Yeah. They're really, really, really digging deep into the Liberal vote.
Last week on the Hurly Burly, I told you about Powerhouse, the biggest and best political affairs conference in Canada, hosted by our original sponsors, the Ontario Real Estate Association, on November 28th in Toronto. The lineup for OREA's Powerhouse Conference is jam-packed, with all of the top decision makers in Ontario politics, including party leaders and key cabinet ministers, who will all be on stage to share their thoughts on the most important issue here and across the country, housing. Today, OREA announced their keynote speaker will be flying in from across the pond for his first event in Canada since he was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Attendees will get to hear Boris Johnson sit down with OREA CEO Tim Hudak to talk housing, politics, and reflect on his time in office. Never one to be upstaged, our very own Scott Reid will join a political panel at OREA's Powerhouse, sharing insight and misadventures while debating some of the hottest issues of the day. So if you're interested in politics, and if you can hear me, it's safe to assume you are, you don't want to miss the OREA Powerhouse Conference, taking place on November 28th at the Westin Harbour Castle Hotel in Toronto. Get your tickets today before they sell out at oreapowerhouse.ca. So, Jordan, to pick up where Scott was going on his interesting first point, I'm going to make a prediction to you and you can react to it. My prediction is that we're not going to get these projects built in a timely fashion, and that these systems will not work, and whatever replaces this will also not work, and there is no social license among all the various groups, and etc. And eventually, there'll be crises. And eventually, we're going to have to decide what rules really matter and what rules don't really matter in order to get this stuff developed, because the world will just pass us by.
I don't disagree entirely. I mean, this is not a regulatory fight. This is a political fight, right? And the problem is that Guilbeault is going to the mic and treating it like this is a regulatory thing and that it's just a technical issue. What I was really struck by, well, besides Kory's newfound love for judicial activism, maybe, was the fact that there was really no attempt on the part of the Liberal government to make any sort of a political case that they're handling this better than the Conservatives would have. And like, I remember back, not even really so long ago, it was 2016 remember when we really needed Northern Gateway? And that was like, and guess who couldn't fucking get it approved because they screwed the process for evaluating it so badly that First Nations were able to get the entire approval overturned. Well, It was the Harper Conservatives. So the record that the Conservatives have to point to on project approvals is not really materially any better. And you actually have a Liberal government who, and I know they want no one to remember this, but this is maybe also part of their problem, who went out and bought a fucking pipeline to get it approved. Like they purchased Trans Mountain so that they could get it through. But they're half pregnant on this, right? You either want to be out there pointing to a record where you're advocating and advancing for these projects, or you want to be sensitive to the fact that a lot of people who have them in the backyards don't love them. And I'm struck that Guilbeault is doing none of the political work around any of this. And it really makes them look weak. I think the technocratic response on this is inadequate. This is a political fight with Smith. This is a political fight with the premiers. Guilbeault brought a knife to the gunfight, and I don't think it's going to serve him well.
We have to back up here because we're conflating different things. All right. So there are things where the federal government has clear jurisdictional authority on projects like this. And it's when they cross provincial boundaries and when you're going to international boundaries. So, a pipeline to Tidewater that goes through another province, that's one where the federal government gets to weigh in under our system. What we're talking about, though, are things that are entirely within the jurisdiction of a province where the federal government is saying, no, we're going to come in and we're going to take your jurisdictional power in this area because we want to, because we say, air is everywhere and air moves across borders. So therefore we can do that.
Fundamentally, it must be
because they feel the provincial systems are inadequate.
That's not our fucking constitution though. And it is a gigantic power grab on the part of the federal government. And it's not just being used on pipelines. It's being used on provincial highways. It's being used on provincial development. It's being used on all kinds of things which were never conceived or talked about when this legislation was even introduced. So it is a fucking power grab of massive proportions. And the fact that the court is saying, no, you got to respect the Constitution, I think is a good thing. I don't think that's judicial activism. It's not judicial activism to say that you're going to have to.
You got to square that circle, eh? Hooray for the courts. I mean, only in this limited circumstance, of course.
Look, okay, but how is it,
This is not judicial activism. This is judicial restraint.
I think I think it is restraint to say that the federal government can't come in. You're trying to confuse a pipeline project with somebody saying you can't build a fucking provincial highway without federal approval. That is a massive change in how we have done regulatory approvals in this country for time in fucking memoriam. And so don't just blanket away as being some non-issue that, came out of nowhere. No, this is a very big change in terms of how we approach these things as a country. And, and it's a power grab. It's a fucking power grab by any measure. And the fact that it's being pushed against by what is, by all accounts, a pretty left-wing court, a pretty sympathetic court to this government, is a sign of just how far across the line they went.
Well, I don't know who wants to respond to this. I'm just going to say I don't give a shit about this legislation one way or another. One thing, but I do think that the government missed another opportunity to talk about the economy and took another opportunity to walk into a frame where they are seen as anti-economic development, as they're the people that are positioned against it. They've got to fucking flip this frame around sometime in the next 2 years. Scott, come to me here. Give me something.
You have to want to. If you're going to flip it around, you have to want to flip it around.
They don't want to flip it around.
Governmentitis. We've talked about it before. I think climate orthodoxy dominates this version of the Liberal Party. I think that's what it is. And I think you got governmentitis where you talk about, this just requires legislative tweaks. It's a politics by briefing note, and these are the results.
But I want to go back to the original premise of the legislation was not to block projects. The original premise of the legislation was to speed up projects. So why don't they return to that theory and say, we're going to work on this to make sure it effectively approves economic development, because we need these critical minerals. We need this, we need that. It's right there for them.
We used to have a natural resources minister who, in effect, at least notionally, represented the interests of development and business and would be an advocate around the cabinet table within reason for those interests. And then you had an environment minister who would, within interest, be an advocate for environmental hesitancy and oversight. But that's not the construct. They looked at that construct. They kind of notionally had a bit of that construct, and they said, no, not good enough. What we want are two strong environmentalists in both portfolios. And therefore, you have a press conference in the reaction to this kind of legislation, and you're going to get an overwhelmingly environmental, anti-development, anti-economic, or at least not anti-economic, but non-economic frame of departure. And that's... Like I come back to, I wasn't joking when I said if you want to change that frame, you have to want to change that frame. I'm not convinced the government feels much like it wants to change that frame.
Okay, let's go on to our last item of the day, the return of the Greenbelt issue. Last week, the RCMP announced they would be investigating the process that led to land being reclassified out of the Greenbelt after the Ontario Provincial Police asked them to take that hot potato from them. This ups the ante on this issue pretty considerably, I think. Today, the government's making its latest attempt to put this issue back in the bottle with a piece of legislation designed to protect the Greenbelt. Scott, just as a matter of process, I'm curious, does the RCMP investigation mean that there will be a steady stream of stories about this, or mean that there will be almost an embargo on stories about this for a period of time?
Closer to the latter. It's a fundamental challenge to the opposition to find a way to maintain the relevance of the story, because there probably won't be a lot of natural events that sustain the story and advance the story. The RCMP will not speak unless you get fluky and there's some, leaks happening, or, some developer or shady Mr. X type lobbyist shits her pants and decides to whistle like a blue jay. It's going to be tougher. And in some respects, I do, by the way, I love this new piece of legislation they're putting in. We're going to put the parcels of land back, and we're going to make it impossible to ever take them out again. Right? It's kind of like
they're so sorry, Scott.
It's kind of funny, right? Like, it is sort of like,
you don't have to trust us anymore. We're changing the law.
That's right. I said, in order to give you the confidence that I won't do the thing I said I wouldn't do after I did do the thing I said I wouldn't do, this fucking time I'm putting legislative handcuffs on myself. God damn it, we got to stop these bastards. Even if the bastards is us. But I thought the most interesting development last week was the Auditor General's announcement that since August, their office has already been investigating MZOs. So if you ask me, how does this story get sustained and create ongoing pain for the government? I think that's the answer. I think those MZOs were flying out of the office like hot crust buns at Easter, and I think that's a real problem. I think there are a bunch of people that probably tried to cash in on that, knowing that the minister and the government were inclined to say yes to any MZO, probably because they genuinely were just like, listen, goddammit, I want to get rid of NIMBYism and we're going to get development going. But then there were people who said, so if the answer is going to be yes, I can go to developers and say, you know what, charge me a success. I'm going to charge you a success fee and make money off of a process that I know is already going to produce a certain result. Ka-ching! I think there's going to be all kinds of fucking bodies buried in that graveyard, and they're all going to come scrambling out. And it will be all bad for Ford. So the RCMP investigation will come to a resolution at some point in the future, months, maybe a year and a half from now. That's not great timing for the election, but I think this MZO thing is going to be a real hammer and an ongoing hammer for the provincial government. And that's what I would be afraid of if I were them.
Kory?
Well, it's bad if the RCMP find a problem, but if they don't, then I think it's vindication and the issues behind you. But I agree, MZO stuff will be an issue, but it's not the only issue that's driving things on this. Like there is a anti-development vote here in the province of Ontario that's quite considerable, particularly in the 416. But there are a lot of people, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, who think the much bigger problem, for instance, if you're a new Canadian or millennial, is the inability to buy a fucking house anywhere in this province. Well, the federal government has the floodgates open of increasing population. So, it's not just the one thing, it's the other. And, things that can be a weapon used against you can also be something that is positive for you at the same time. And I think ultimately there's one side of this issue that you're better to be on than the other. And the side of the issue that's better to be on is the people who are trying to get things built, whether it's what we talked about just most recently on economic development at a time when people are feeling economic anxiety, or whether it's getting housing built at a time when people can't find a fucking house that's under, $1 million. So I think it's a combination of competing interests and competing issues. They're kind of diametrically opposed, but if you're not going to override municipalities on zoning things, you're not going to get any housing built. That's just the fucking reality of it. And so you're going to have that. And will people make money when you build houses or do anything in the economy? Yes, they will. And will you find evidence that people make money? Yes, you will. But I'm not sure that's entirely a bad thing. I think the bad thing is not having any housing built. I think that's the much worse thing. I think the much worse thing is not, social license around pipelines, et cetera. I think it's not having any economic activity. I think it's not having the Ring of Fire built. I think it's not having new highways and transit construction. Like if you look at MZOs, do you know what a lot of them have been around? Transit-oriented communities along subway lines. Because as much as people, want to see the Ontario line built in downtown Toronto, they don't want to have the coffee shop next to them get bulldozed for a new transit stop. They don't want to have 6 trees that University and Queen cut down to have a new transit stop. So look, the province is going to have to override municipalities to get anything done. That's just a fact. And I think getting things done, if you've campaigned on getting it done, is probably a lot more in your political interest than just turtling and saying, okay, well, I guess we'll just do nothing. That's what we're here for.
Jordan, I hosted a debate among the Liberal leadership candidates last week. And when I asked them what the impact of the Greenbelt issue would be on an election in 2026, they said the next election will be about integrity in Ontario. Do you think that's right?
Absolutely. And I admire Kory's spirited defense, but I call complete fucking horseshit on it. This is a huge problem for the Ford government. This is a massive problem, and it's now a ticking time bomb for them that they've lost control of. The problem is that when there's a potential that the money-making is corrupt or the money-making is for specific people who are friends of the premier, that is absolutely a massive political problem. And now the timeline of this is out of the hands of the premier's office. So you've got an RCMP investigation. You don't know when that's going to surface. You don't know what that's going to surface with. So this is going to probably come up, I think, again, at a very inconvenient time when maybe this issue might become more buried. I think that the opposition in Ontario has done a good job so far of driving the issue through their own opposition research and their own requests, through the Auditor General, through the Integrity Commissioner. They're using every tool at their disposal to continue to pick at other edges of this story. And so they're going to keep doing that. I absolutely agree that the bodies are buried in the MZOs and those zombies are going to start walking pretty soon. So with all due respect to Kory, I do think people are concerned about housing, but you can also see a really big difference in potential approaches to that. You've got the feds coming in with a massive checkbook saying, I'm going to let you guys decide how you want to change your own municipal rules to have access to this massive pot of money. And once you figure that out, you let me know when you'll get the money. Or you have the Ford approach where it's his buddies who stand to make over $8 billion. Like, I just think the stink of that does not come off as easily as Kory might wish it would. And the issue is no longer about housing. The issue is now about in whose interest Doug Ford is working. And that is absolutely lethal.
Well, let's just be clear. Nobody has any buddies in the development community. And insofar as they have people who are political donors, et cetera, they are of absolute, well, you can smirk all you want. But
no. You can't get away with that. The premier does because he literally said, and the ethics commissioner ruled in his favor, that because the development people are his close personal friends, he goes to his wedding without it being a conflict.
All right. Okay. So, you can cut me off or you can let me finish making the point. Okay. The person who's supposedly the leading candidate for the Liberal leadership in Ontario has the exact same friend network within that community insofar as they're friends, with the exact same
excellent
list
Liberal
of
leader.
Well, right, and the exact same list of donors, and and some of those MZOs are in her neighborhood, but there's a lot of development that's been approved in the city of Mississauga over the last decade, which has never really been looked at, but I guarantee it will be looked at very closely now too.
If this is the fight that's setting up in the next campaign, who is more in the pocket of developers than others, I love that.
I don't know if the next election will actually turn on integrity, but you can do a lot of damage to a government and really weaken their ability to be reelected, even if the election turns on another specific issue. And what this story really needs is a stupid slime bag. Like when these stories really get going and you have a stupid slime bag who says, God damn it, I'm not going to listen to Reason or my lawyers or anybody. I'm going to go out there and talk to the Toronto Star and turn this thing around. That's when it gets great. I was entitled to make that money and I was entitled to my entire. You need the stupid slime bag. When you get the stupid slime bag and every morning you're in the premier's office and you open up the newspaper or you listen to the radio and you think, oh my fucking God, can't someone push that guy off a water tower? That's what you want. You need the stupid slime bag.
I mean, if Kory's spirited defense of the profit motive here is any indication, who knows? We might get one.
All right, let's wrap it up with our hey yous. Mr. Pinsent, can you bring some decorum to these proceedings, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The hey yous are about to begin.
All right, who's got a hey you?
I do.
Do you?
I do.
Do it.
My hey you today is going out to Heather Stephenson, who in her new civilian role has some thoughts about some of the advertising in the Manitoba campaign and has some regrets about running the billboard that was against searching the landfill.
Really? I
for
didn't
the remains.
see this. Sorry.
Yeah, it was, I think it was out this morning.
Okay.
She was on CBC talking about how she regrets that it hurt people. And that is I think the appropriate feeling to have about what we've talked about as a pretty odious campaign. When you are the leader and you have people in the back room advising you on this stuff during a campaign, it is on you to say no. It is on you to do that as leader during a campaign. You are going to get all kinds of advice, and it is the job of your advisors to provide a path to victory that they believe is the strongest one. And it's the job of a leader to make sure that path aligns with your values. And so my hey you is to Heather Stephenson. I'm glad you're sorry, but it's too late.
In my
regrets,
I've
had a few, but then again, too few to mention.
What is that, your Joe Piscopo version of
That's my Joe Piscopo Sinatra.
I would just say, Jordan, that in my experience, has she won the election, she'd have different reflections on her advertising campaign.
I have no
doubt. Anybody else got a hey you?
Well, I've got one.
All right.
The leader of the Ontario NDP. Time to say goodbye to Sarah Gemma, the Hamas adjacent MPP in your caucus, who, is apologetic, will not retract her terrible statements that she made. And as long as you want to have people like that sit in your caucus, you're going to be tainted with the stench of being, support and giving safe harbor to absolutely repugnant points of view. And I think if you don't want to be associated with that, you got to say goodbye to some people. We've certainly said goodbye to people in the Conservative Party on a number of things over the years, some of them much, much more minor than that. And it's time to do the right thing and throw that member out of your caucus.
All right. Scott?
My hey you goes out to all the soon-to-be wannabe critics who are about to develop a gigantic case of presidential penis envy. I know that we were holding off on talking about Israel today because we're going to be doing a live event that'll be largely dedicated to that issue later this week. But there's a rumor, a news report that contains a rumor that President Biden is thinking about going to Israel. That means the clock has now started on Post Media and others who will start saying, well, if Biden's going, why isn't the prime minister? And why is Trudeau so late? Why is Trudeau lagging so badly? How come Canada's being humiliated on the world stage by not having the prime minister in Israel this minute or 14 minutes ago? Gear down. This is the Middle East. This is a war. This is an unbelievable powder keg. President Biden going there probably is going to play some massive strategic important role in terms of trying to rally the region. Let's not turn this into cheap domestic politics. No presidential penis envy, not on this day and on this circumstance.
Can you have penis envy of an 80-year-old man?
See, now, David, you just have to take it to the most juvenile place imaginable. We're talking about weighty matters of world politics.
There's pills for that
sometimes
now.
the show's a caricature, guys.
The answer is sure I could.
All right, my hey you goes out to every member of the Liberal cabinet. Any circumstance in which you're going to be in front of a microphone, no matter what the issue is, find a way to talk about the economy and what you're doing to either make life more affordable for people or to improve the general jobs and economic environment in the country. The current standing that the government has on economic management, on jobs, on growth, on all that stuff, the government is unre-electable in this circumstance. And it is impossible to win re-election unless the government improves its economic management record. And that's going to take a sustained turnaround in the economy, but it's also going to take a sustained messaging effort by the government. And I think you should really think of everything as an opportunity to talk about the economy. All right, folks. That's our show for this week. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN and OREA, the Ontario Real Estate Association. I want to thank everybody who watched or listened. Thanks for being here with us again today. You three, always great to hang out. And we'll see everybody again next week with, maybe even later this week with more of The Curse of Politics. See you then.